So what we're going to do now in this lecture and over the next 4 lectures after this, that is a total 5 lectures, is to look at structuralism and all the various offshoots that grew out of this, which is why I'm calling it structuralism and its posts. It's a play on word which the structuralists and the post-structuralists and the post-modernists and the post-colonialists and the various other posts, right, they do. We'll end by looking at a school of historians, school used in the conventional sense of the word, a school of historians who are called Subaltern Studies, which was heavily influenced by this whole tradition of structuralism, post-coloniality, but also influenced by certain very important Marxist trends of thought, mainly coming from Antonio Gramsci. So this is how the outline is going to be, right? We're going to have, can we also have these lights off so that the screen can be seen well? So while he is doing that, let me continue. So what we'll do is today we'll talk about structuralism. Yeah.
For recording, the light should be there.
Okay, that's all right. So you can see this, right? The board is clear. So what we'll do is today we'll do structuralism. Yeah. So we are going to do structuralism today, and we are going to look closely at 2 scholars whose ideas were foundational to structuralism: the linguist Ferdinand de Saussure and the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss. We are then, in the next lecture, going to move on to post-structuralism, which is what happened when structuralism developed. It became, from its internal critiques. And there we'll look at these 3 mainly these 3 scholars. Interestingly, these 3 scholars, especially the first 2, but also the third, they're all also seen as structuralists in some sense. But they made the main shift to post-structuralism, enabled post-structuralism. We'll take a short diversion to look at what is post-modernism, where basically we'll look at what are the 3 central claims of modernism and how post-modernism builds a critique. So when you say we are modern, what do you mean? And what does post-modernism mean there? And then we'll see post-colonialism, which talks about how the colonial subject, how colonialism became a very important constitutive fact of modern world, and what it did to our way of thinking, way of looking at the world. And then finally we'll get to subaltern studies. This is how the 5 lectures are going to be. So we'll start with structuralism. To start with structuralism, we need to go back to where we started this course with, the idea of humanism. Now, if you remember, the whole intellectual effort in the humanities, social sciences, the very word humanities, to refer to studying human society, human beings, what they do, right, was to center the focus of knowledge on human beings. Till now we had the focus of knowledge was about what God did, what divine laws did, and how best could humans fit into divine laws, what God had done. So the focus of knowledge had to understand God's will. That shifted to understanding human agency, what humans did, why they did, under what conditions did what human being did what was the consequence of what humans did. So earlier, in the earlier conception, it was about human beings are mere instruments of God, of divine will. The whole effort from the 16th century onwards, and particularly in the 19th century when all these different social science and humanities disciplines emerged, was to look at human agency. So history was about what human beings did in the past. How did the past change? How did we come to what we are today? By looking at human actions. Sociology like this. Economy was about how human beings organize their relations of production and distribution. Literature was about how human beings express themselves in language. So all of this was about human agency. Human agency was picked up and put on the throne. This is what everyone needs to study. But while it was put up on the throne, it was crowned as the supreme goal, the thing that everyone has to focus on. There was also a simultaneous realization that just disparate evidence of human action, what are called facts, right? What is a fact? A fact is human action which is disparate, like one human action, the other human action, all these things that are there. Now, is there some pattern to it? Can we think of laws which are like natural laws, the laws of physics, the laws of chemistry, maybe even a mathematical law? Can we think of that? Can we think of some structure to human agency? That human agency works in a certain pattern. There is a certain trend which is possible. So the emergence of sociology, for example, was through the works of Auguste Comte, another Frenchman, who said that historians collect facts and we, through the science of positivism, then find patterns in it. So the whole idea was to see, can we find out patterns and trends? Non-social scientists, philosophers like Hegel, or for that matter, somebody outside the academy like Karl Marx, were at that time trying to build up laws of their own, which we had seen in earlier lectures. But there was this common pattern, common effort which was emerging while human agency had been crowned as the most important thing to study. And it is through this trying to find patterns, trying to find certain laws, generalizations, can we say something essential about something? That this is how it is. Students as a group do this. Indians as a group do this. Women as a group do this. Adults as a group do this. Or anything. Can we find some way of finding patterns, structure to human agency? Structuralism emerged out of that. So structuralism basically was an attempt to find structure within everything that human beings do. How can we find a pattern which is universal, which explains human actions? Unlike divine law, the big difference here was that these structures were not supposed to be divinely given from outside. Human beings, through their agency, actually have built up these structures. So whether it is language, whether it is society, whether it is any structure, any pattern, any law, it is something which has come from human action. But it is something which undergirds everything that human beings do. That is what structuralism said. There cannot be, the claim that structuralism made was, there cannot be anything beyond the structure. You cannot act outside of the structure. It puts limits. Because it puts limits, it enables. And we are going to look at all of these in great detail, so I just want to put these up in front. Some of these will not be very explanatory, self-explanatory right now. They might just seem propositions I'm putting up, but it'll come. But this thing about puts limits yet enables. So a structuralist would argue that think of a game of football. If you just had two people hitting the ball, you cannot have the game of football. There are these limits put by the field, the goalposts, which are given. There are certain rules. Who can pass the ball to whom? How? What can you use to hit the ball? What can't you use? Where? Who can use what part of their body to hit the ball? How do you do it? There are all these rules. There's a structure. If you didn't have that structure, you cannot have the game of football. So it limits. You cannot take the ball outside the white line. You cannot pass it to somebody who's offside. So that limits. But without those limitations, there will not be any enabling. You cannot enable a game of football. It is both. The limit is the thing which enables us to do anything, human agency. So a great player is possible because the limits enable him or her to do things. Now, what comes out of this, I mean, of course, the football field is clearly given, but the rules, even the field, for example, often, we don't see it really. And for structuralists, they're saying how we act in society, how we act in history, how language is structured. These are often abstract. The structures are abstract. They're hidden in plain sight. It's not always easy to identify them. But social scientists have to identify them if they have to understand what lies beyond what human beings do. So why are you dressed in a certain way? Why do you behave in a certain way? Why do you eat something? Why do people do anything that they do? It is not just about what people feel like. Even feelings are based on structures. And these are abstract things which need to be identified. But the moment you look at them, there you almost feel it's hidden in plain sight. The end of it, structuralism makes an argument that structure is primary. Human agency actually is secondary. You cannot have human agency unless you have a structure. Human agency is only possible within the overall structure. Now, these are the points. We'll come back to them over the course of this class, but let's start with this respectable professor. You see how professors have changed over the 100 years, right? Yeah, that's how Saussure looked. He was a professor in the university in Geneva, and he was actually, interestingly, a professor of Sanskrit. So his life's interest, much of his work was on Sanskrit. But right from the beginning, he had taken a structural approach to the study of languages, and we'll see what that means and why the study of language becomes the bedrock on which all structuralism develops. I mean, this is how it happened. Sometime in, I think, the first decade of the 20th century, the university asked him to give a course on general linguistics, the principles of the study of language. And he, in a sense, built up these new principles. He was very dissatisfied with the general principles of the study of language. So he built up a whole new set of principles. He never wrote a book. He just gave lectures from notes, and he was so dissatisfied with his notes that he didn't preserve those notes. He suddenly died in 1913. He had only done 4 courses of this. 4 times he had taught this course. His students, after he passed away, realized that he had really contributed something extraordinary, something which nobody had done till now. So they sat together, took notes, which is why I keep telling you, take notes, right? If I pop it and there's no video recording, right, I have some hope. But, so the students got together and they published a book called the Course in General Linguistics. It had a French name, but it's popularly known as CGL. From their notes. And so they asked, was it right? Did he say this? Did he say that? over the 4 years. They put it together. I think there were 2 or 3 students who were the lead authors in this, but they published it in his name. So who's the author? And this is a very interesting question we'll come back to in the next class when we talk about Barthes, one of the people we had spoken about earlier, post-structuralism. What this person said, Ferdinand de Saussure, was that languages have a basic structure. So you don't study languages, you study language. Every language has a system in it. In fact, I'm not somebody who's studied Saussure in great detail. In fact, I've only read him second-hand, secondary sources. But as far as I remember reading, he actually never used the word structure or structuralism. He used the word system. So for him, this, right, was what needs to be studied, the system in which language is organized. And he said there are 2 ways of looking at language. One is this, diachronic, which is how people have looked at it till now. And the other is synchronic. So what is the difference between these 2? Diachronic is over time. This is, so how did Sanskrit develop? Over time. What happened to the various words? What happened to syntax? What happened to grammar? So you study any language in that manner. But synchronic meant you take a slice from a slice of time and just look at it at that moment in the structure that it has. He also said that the most important thing in the study of language is the sign. This is the basic constituent element, right? The sign. And what is a sign? It tells us about something other than itself. This is not a sign. If I say this is a pen, well, this is not a pen, but assuming this is a pen, this, if I say is a pen, this is not a sign in a sense. I mean, in the way we are talking about, we'll see that why it is actually also a sign in linguistics, because it's a pen. But if there is a sign which says this is the pen, that is a sign because it tells us about something which it is not. He says that all words and phrases are basically signs. Everything. Words are basically signs. They tell us about something beyond. And the words are composed of 2 parts. We'll come to each of these in great detail, but just see this. Words are composed, signs are composed of 2 parts. There is the signifier and the signified. So what is the signifier and what is the signified? We'll come to that later. The signifier is what tells us. So when I say table or when I say pen, the sound pen is the signifier. And what is signified is this.
The idea of pen.
Yeah, the concept. And he said language is also composed of 2 parts, lang and parole. And the relation between these is arbitrary. Now we'll come to this arbitrary thing because it's crucial to understand a whole range of things that structuralists and post-structuralists argue about. In fact, in a sense, when I've been talking about Marxism or the Annales school, I've been telling you a lot of their ideas have become common sense. A lot of this has become common sense. But let's get to lang and parole. he said language has to be studied as a system. What does he mean by that? We cannot, he argued, study different languages. So you cannot study Urdu and Sanskrit and Spanish and Tibetan and Swahili, because at the end of it, what do you do with it? So I know a lot about Swahili, this word changed. I know about Tibetan, this is how it is written, this is how it's spoken. But what do I do with it? The only way to understand Tibetan or Swahili or German or any language in the world is to understand it as a system. And he says when you look at that, the system, the general patterns, right, which make up the language, the patterns are made up of elements. These elements constitute the language. And the linguist, what the linguist needs to do is to understand the relation. This is crucial because the structure is basically these relations. This is what the linguist has to do. You have to identify the general elements, then look at the relations between them, and when you look at this, you build general patterns which make up language. And finally, most importantly for the linguist, you are studying language, not languages. Because he said, at a structural level, as a system, language is all the same. So you might speak any language. You might speak Telugu, Marathi, Bengali, Punjabi, or any of the thousands of languages in the world, but as a basic structure, every language is the same. And that's the distinction that we had made in the previous slide, between Lang and Parole. Lang and Parole. Lang is the So Lang, as he called it, is the structure, the basic structure. You do not study language over time. He said, of course you have to, finally, but you can do this diachronic, across time study of language only once you have established the structure of language, the system. And that system has to be seen as its inner structure. So if you think this is a long period of time, what you need to do is take a slice out and just look at that slice. How, not over time, not how the word use is changing, how its meaning is changing, how grammar is changing, how syntax is changing, but just look at how these relate to each other. One point of view to describe the entire system. And this, he said, right here, Lang is the abstract system, the basic structure, which a linguist has to identify. And Parole is the speech act. So I'm speaking. So instead of, say, the difference is this. Once you understand Lang, the basic structure, even if Parole changes, you can still get it. So once you know English, then however it is said, however it is written, you understand it. The accents might change. Sometimes you might, like a poet, play around with words here and there. You might use synonyms, you might use different words. Anything that you do, people can still communicate. It can change over time. But the lang has to remain the same. Behind the structure of language, Saussure said, are the signs. These signs are what we know as words. Now, what is a word? Anything that you take, this sign, the word refers to something beyond what is evident to you. So you might say table, and of course this is a table, this is a table. You might say spectacles, this is a spectacle, there are people in the class wearing spectacles. You might say a watch, there's watch here, there's watch there, there's watches everywhere. What does it exactly refer to? It refers to something we have in our mind, an abstract idea. So when I tell you that please close the door, it can be a door like this, it can be a door very different, it can be a sliding door, anything. You'll realize what a door means and how is it different from a window. There can be a very large window and a small door, but you will get that difference. There can be a very large table and a very small bed, but you'll know the difference. They might look the same. In one of the previous classes I had spoken about this film, The Gods Must Be Crazy. So the whole idea of, if you don't have that concept, how do you name it? You don't have the sign. If among people, suddenly you have a can of Coke, you don't know what it is. If this pen suddenly goes back in time and lands up in Saussure's class, nobody would know what this is, because this is not a pen. It can't write. It looks like one, but it isn't. He said, for signs to work, for us to understand words, we must understand that words are not just words. Words is an inexact term. The term is signs. They're all linguistic. In fact, what we should do here is add a linguistic sign. Words are linguistic signs. They point us to something, a concept, an idea. And these signs are composed of two parts. There is the concept of the table, but there's also this acoustic image, what he calls the acoustic image. Table, the bringing together of these sounds. Table, pen, the bringing together of these. So I might change the accent, I might change the way of saying it. Sometimes I can even change the way it is written. I can say, well, why table? I can say or I don't know, you could, but when you pronounce it, you will get it. Sometimes the same acoustic image refers to two different things, and we'll see that in the next slide. The same acoustic sound. Can you think of something where the same acoustic sound, acoustic image, sorry, acoustic sound is an oxymoron, but acoustic image refers to two different things? Weak. Yes. Weak because you have not eaten. You get up late and miss your breakfast. And every time you go back on your holidays, your parents tell you you have gone so weak. And a week as in a period of time. And maybe if the pronunciation is different, if you are half Bengali like me, it can also mean wick of a lamp. I just said weak. And if you knew what I was meaning, right, you'd get that link between the signifier and the signified. I can say please sit, and you'll get it that I'm just mispronouncing sit. Because that link between the signifier and signified is there. You can, this is perhaps not a good idea, but let me take some other part of the screen and write. Say, for example, you can say, right, in the context that is given, you'll get it. So the acoustic image is also the symbol. And when you start reading quickly, you are looking at symbols. So you're not reading every letter. When you read table, you don't read T, A, B, L, E. You just look at that symbol. It's in some senses perhaps almost like reading the Chinese script. You're looking at a symbol and know what it is. And that symbol might change, and a novelist might put in a different spelling for a character, but you'll still get it. The signifier and the signified together create the sign. They create the linguistic sign, the word. Now, we have all of this, right? Mouse. How many mice are there in that photograph? 3, 2, 1? How many? And of course, these guys are not getting it, right? There's a problem between the signifier and signified for two of these mice. The third one perhaps doesn't care. And this brings us to the point, one of the crucial points for historians, sociologists, people who are looking at society, is the fact that the link between the signifier and the signified is totally arbitrary. What does he mean by that? What does Saussure mean when he says that the link between saying this is a mouse and this is a mouse and the sound or the text M-O-U-S-E, when you look at it, what is that link? Is there something natural? There isn't. Is there some rational basis why the sound mouse means either of these or one of these? Suppose somebody had said that this thing will now be called a hat. Is there any inherent natural or rational basis on which you can say this cannot be called a hat, or for that matter, this cannot be called a hat. Remember, I don't know whether it was in your class or in the other class, I was talking about how words change. So 40 years ago, if there had been, you had restaurants which are not particularly focused on the LGBT crowd calling themselves gay lords, because the word gay didn't mean what it means today. It's completely arbitrary. There is no rational basis for the way in which the signifier and signified is linked. Why is it called a table? Who's the creator? So earlier you had God. So how does the Bible begin? In the beginning was the Word. And not just the Bible, most religious texts, most things was language is created by God, just like time. So all the meanings have been invested by God, which is why religious texts say you actually can't translate them. So you talk to a devout Muslim, he'll say the Quran actually cannot be translated. It's an approximation, because that's God's word. The meanings are inscribed, set in stone, like it was done for Moses, literally. For all of them, right? The Rig Ved, the Gita, these are, the meanings are given. You cannot decide, ki, oh, well, over 2000 years the meaning has changed. That's not possible. But today, that was the shift that happened with the social sciences and humanities over 300 years, where divine will and God's commandment, as it were, went away. So now you have structures which are actually done by us. So who decided that this will not be called a hat but will be called a mouse? Or maybe he could have said, well, hat doesn't make sense, but he could have called it pointy thingy. Right? I can see an American call it a pointy thingy. Right? Who made the mouse? Does anyone know who made the mouse? Who invented the mouse? Yeah? I have no clue. I'll take your word for it. Either way, whoever did it called it the mouse. He could have called it anything. He could have called it the squirrel. There's no reason why, do mice go and point to things? They don't. He could have called it the parrot, because the parrots actually sometimes go and pick up cards for your future, right? Or he could have called it anything. The point is, there is no natural basis, and this is important. You see, both this natural basis, nothing fixed and given. Second, this link, right? This link between the signifier and the signified, this it is not derived from rationality, from the use of reason. What defines it? Convention. If people stop using it, calling it a mouse, but the thing is, it's convention. You cannot change it arbitrarily. Because it is arbitrary, if it was based on reason, if there was a natural basis, if that basis changed, then people could have said, oh, that basis has changed, now we need to call it something else. That isn't there, it's arbitrary. Why is a certain sound, or why is a collection of certain symbols on paper or on the screen referring to something? It's completely arbitrary. That arbitrariness is conventional. It is the basis of communication. If I start calling this a hat, you will not understand. I will not be able to communicate with you. So you have all these little, literary tricks, especially in certain forms of literature, where what one person is saying doesn't make sense at all. Now, if I tell you right now, take your kangaroo, jump over the igloo, and sit on a kayak. When I mean, take your pen and go and sit on the next chair. It is impossible to communicate because I've broken these conventions. All these words that I have used they're arbitrary. There is no reason that a pen should be called a pen, or an igloo should be called an igloo, or a kangaroo should be called a kangaroo, and why not a koala bear? Because neither are bears, right? But the point is, it is impossible for anyone to break convention. You cannot. A government often tries, it's impossible to change it. You keep saying, change the name, this is not to be called. So once in a rare while, they might make something of a convention. But you cannot. So the meaning that is given is arbitrary. It's a function of convention. What happens in society? And the meaning, this is a slightly difficult point here. The meaning is based on difference in signs. So we are talking about weak and weak. We are talking about mouse and mouse. So there has to be some difference somewhere, either in the signifier or in the signified. Somewhere. The meanings we generate are based on this. So language works. The structure of language is what? It's a whole system of signs below which the basic constitutive structure is what? That these signs are composed of a signifier and a signified. And the relation between them is arbitrary, and the only way we can make meaning is when we know how to make difference in the signs. The markers of difference in form, how they are different. The content, how they are different. In this manner, if you look at language, all languages are the same. There is a basic structure of languages which does not change. Language is a system governed by its own internal order, whose interrelated elements derive value only from the simultaneous presence of of all other elements. So basically interrelated, right? Okay, let me use this. This is better than walking into the light. It's a system whose own internal order is based on interrelated elements, how the elements relate to each other. And this system can only be understood as a synchronic unity, that it is a perfect structure at any given moment of time. Of course, languages change, as we know. That this thing wasn't called a mouse earlier. This thing didn't even exist. New things come up and they are given sometimes older names. Mouse is just one example. So many new things. Our Indian languages, for example, are full of that. So the word desh, as a historian, if you go back 200 years, the use of desh means completely different from what it means today. The use of jati means completely different 200 years ago from what it does today. All these words. But at any given time, to understand language, we have to understand it as a system which works through a linkage of, so what is the structure? The structure is all this linkages. It's it could be anything as complex. All these points whatever, all these points, right, they are linked to each other. If this is like a little slice we have cut off from a large stream of time, we have cut it off. So there's a large stream of time and we are just looking at that. We're not looking at change over time. This is how the structure works. This is how it is. And this, mind you, they'll say keeps changing. Structure changes. Because structure is not God-given. Structure changes as and when human beings change structure. But it is impossible, well, I wouldn't say impossible. For the structuralist, it is very, very difficult for one person to change the structure. There might be one or two points in time when somebody can change a structure with something or some element of it. But typically it changes through human action, which is possible only within the bounds of this. And that human action over time might change structure. But we cannot understand human action unless we look at this. Look at the larger structure in which human action is happening. So from here, I'd like to move on to the next person for today. Do keep in mind that these are really small snapshots. So Saussure, of course, has a lot to say about the diachronous study of languages. He has much more to say about the system for the study of languages. If you're interested, you should look up. But what I have taken out here are only elements which are useful to understand structuralism for social scientists, particularly for historians. How historians have used it. So same with Claude Lévi-Strauss. Now, what are we going to do here? We are going to look at what was it from Claude Lévi-Strauss's work. And he was somebody who lived 100 years. Born in the first decade of the 20th century, died in the first decade of the 21st. One of, in a sense, the founders of modern anthropology. He came, in a sense, a generation after the people who founded the discipline, but in a sense, modern anthropology cannot be thought of without Claude Lévi-Strauss. And what he did was he instituted what is called structural anthropology, built on the ideas of Saussurian linguistics. So his main point was that society has to be studied synchronistically as a system. You cannot study society, you cannot understand society diachronically. To understand what is society? What is human society? How do humans live? How do interact with each other? What makes us human? You need to understand the underlying system. That is the Saussurean Lang, the basic structure. And he was making a universal claim. He was saying, he was an anthropologist. So what do anthropologists do? Anthropologists would go and look at various societies and try and see how do people live, how do they marry, how do they grow their food, how do they build their houses, how do they socially interact, how do they deal with nature, what are their ideas of justice, what are their ideas of virtue, what are their ideas of crime and punishment, etc., etc. He said there is a common structure to all human society. That was an astounding universalist claim of that time. He was making this claim in the first half of the 20th century, when not just Western academia, the whole world, in a sense, was based on the idea of racial superiority. It was not just the Führer in Germany who had these delusions of Aryan superiority, it was the democracies of Europe and America which were basically founded on the idea that human beings are different in fundamental ways, superior and inferior. So for that point, this was a very radical idea, that all human societies are structured the same, irrespective of what that society is. It could be a small band, which is, anthropologists wouldn't even call them a tribe, a small band of maybe 100 people living in the Amazon without any features which anthropologists and sociologists of that time would call civilized, to society in New York or Paris. The basic structure, he said, is the same. But they express it differently. So while the structure is the same, the expression is different. So different people speak different languages. The same language, people speak differently. They mix up languages. So society does the same thing. Society expresses that common structure differently. And if you notice, Saussure builds, which I didn't talk about there, but if you notice, Saussure structure is built on a certain binary. It's not the computer science binary, but it is similar, 0 and 1. So everything is this and that. So Lang and parole, signifier, signified, diachronous, synchronous. The whole idea is that at its most fundamental level, the atomic level perhaps, of social reality, of reality of language, everything is in binaries, comes in binaries. And in this, Lévi-Strauss particularly, but also maybe Saussure, were perhaps influenced by the larger Hegelian view of dialectics, you know, the thesis, antithesis, constantly with each other. So one, the opposite of it. So you have Lang, you have parole, you have signified, you have the signifier. He drew on this and developed it into a whole system of understanding society. He said human thought, right? Society structure, everything is composed of binaries. And that's how society works. We'll come to that. And one of his book is called The Raw and the Cooked, the binary. So what does he think about society as structure? Is this too small to see at the back? You can manage to see it? Yeah. So he, again, like Saussure, they will, should be a comma here. Like Saussure, he broke with existing scholarship in anthropology, which had looked at society diachronically. So you look at society, how does it develop, what happens, how it changes over time. He said, we need to look at society as a system. The history of a people is irrelevant to the daily operation of their social structure. It doesn't matter. For a sociologist, you don't need to know how caste came, how patriarchy came, how the gender division of labor happened, how rules of social engagement happened, how the classroom got structured over 100 years. You don't need to know. You just need to know what is the structure which runs it, within which all of these actions take place. That's all you need to know. And basically that human society is the same in its basic structure. From the most primitive to the high industrial societies, all societies, right, is the same. The structure of human thought, and this is important, right? The structure of human thought is the same. And what is the structure of human thought? It is these binaries that we'll come to. That human beings see the world in certain binaries. And there are certain constitutive things which build the deep grammar of society. And for a sociologist, anthropologist, anybody studying society, what we need to do is to study identify what are the constituent elements. Just like in language, we identified what is the constituent element. For this society, we have to identify the constituent elements of all social structures and identify how they are related, how do they interact with each other. And societies differ because these constituent elements, the basic structure which is the same, the constituent elements, they interact perhaps differently. So society of pastoralists or society of forest hunter-gatherers will have certain different interactions, certain different ways in which different binaries will work than an industrial society or an agricultural society. That is what the sociologist or the anthropologist, when you are studying society, you need to do. This was his primary argument. About binaries, he said binary opposition is the fundamental organizer for human thought. So what are these, right? You have male, female, high and low. Everything is us and them, which later gets picked up through the self and the other, us and them, the civilized and the savage, culture, nature, opposing binaries, presence and absence. How are culture and nature opposing each other? The whole way we look at it is that what is human culture is something we build over nature. The state of being natural is to slowly lose all your culture. So I'll give you an example. In literature, you have all these abiding binaries of people, kids, who have grown up without culture among animals in nature. So you have Tarzan, you have Kim. They are nature. So human beings, so the whole idea is how far from nature do you go, that much civilized you become. The closer to nature you are, the more savage you are. It's a binary. The more there is a presence of one is predicated on the absence of the other. So the more civilized you are, there is a greater absence of the savage. And you can only be civilized when you know that there is an absence there, which is the savage. So his idea was that our thought, our language, our actions, human actions, predicated on language, language predicated on human thought, it is basically constantly working with these binaries. So the idea that we, us, and them, you're constantly working with that. And he says these binaries, and it's not just one binary. So raw and cooked. Raw is nature, cooked is culture. And how well you cook it. So high culture has the most exquisite forms of cooking. Well, supposedly. These days, sometimes when I see television, food shows, the most exquisite forms of cooking is basically serving raw food with a lot of decoration. So I think it's taken a full circle. But the fact is, even when I'm saying this and making a joke about this, I'm working with this binary. So what Lévi-Strauss says is that human thought cannot go outside of these binaries. Because the moment you are saying something, you can say that only by positing a difference with what it is not. Male, female, for example, societies, one of the basic binaries, male, female. Some societies inscribe male, female into language. It's so central to thought, that binary. Hindi, for example. I've never understood why the police is striling. I mean, now you have police who are striling, as in women get into the police. But when I was growing up, a policeman was typically a very muscular, masculine man. But mooch. Now, of course, in 2018, when we are gender fluid, or at least that's the aspiration, you can say, well, mooch need not be masculine. But when I was growing up again, and when I was first reading this, right, mooch was very clearly identified with a man. But it is thrilling. So I never understood why that was there, which actually told me that language is completely arbitrary. But for us here, male and female are inscribed into everything, that binary. High and low, who's high, who's low, constantly. It's not just about whether you call your seniors by 1 year sir and ma'am, and you call your juniors by 1 year kids. Right? Don't be embarrassed. But the fact is, high and low is something which is, again, a constituent, structural element of society. And you're constantly working with this. So a society which is constantly saying everybody is equal is also working with this binary at some level. where you are constantly working with this binary to say the high and low needs to be mediated. And this question of mediation will come to. So he says that binary opposition, Lang parole, the structure of society and its expression, signifier, signified, all of these are basic. They constitute, these are the fundamental element of all social structures. You need to identify what are the binaries which organize a society, how are they expressed, how do they relate to each other. How does the binary of male and female relate to high and low, to us and them, to civilized and savaged, culture and nature, to all of these, presence and absence. So actually you can make a line, right? You can make a line from male, high, us, civilized, culture, presence. A lot of societies are organized like that. And the female is low, it's the other, savage, closer to nature, and the absence. You could do that. A lot of, in fact, following Lévi-Strauss's ideas, a lot of anthropologists, well, not anthropologists, scholars across the fields, social scientists, feminists, have actually made this link. This is how society is organized. It may be another way around, where male is high, is us, is civilized, but something else, some other binary works. He looked at three main things where he developed these theories: kinship, myth, and the gift. He said, so one of the things when Claude Lévi-Strauss was becoming an anthropologist, starting his first work, publishing, one of the things that everybody, all anthropologists would look at is kinship. How are people related to each other? Who marries whom? Where does the family reside? With the mother or with the father? Who gives identity to the family? Who can marry whom? How is it done? And of course, every society had a plethora of variations, and of course there were a million different societies. What he did was, he said we need to break it down into its basic structures: wife givers and wife takers. And basically kinship is about who's a wife giver and who's a wife taker. And society is structured around that. So once you look at that binary, I'm just giving you an example here, right? There are various other things he talked about kinship. I'm just trying to illustrate how this binary worked and how he looked at society as a structure. So, wife givers and wife takers. Who gives the wife? Who takes the wife? The children, how do they link then to as wife takers and wife givers? Who can you marry, who you can't marry? How does the incest taboo work? Can you marry your first cousin? Can you marry your uncle? Can you marry your sister? Can you marry your parent? Where does the incest taboo come in? How does it work? That is the basic structure in which society works. And once you get that basic structure, then you can look at all the million different varieties and understand them structurally. You can compare them across societies, and you can actually compare a social structure in Paris with a social structure deep into the Amazon rainforest, because this is the basic structure. You're working with that binary. Wife takers, wife givers. And when a society organizes this, every society has an incest taboo. Now, what do you mean by an incest taboo? As mammals, there is nothing natural, right? There is nothing natural in us procreating with our blood relatives, whether parents, brothers and sisters. There's nothing. Monkeys do that, dogs do that. And if there is actually, it's not a repeating pattern, then there is no, even by modern science, for example, there is no problem. There are all these species who thrive. There is no incest taboo in any other species other than human beings. So he says every human society has put in an incest taboo. If you go back to Saussurian linguistics, this is arbitrary. That is not to say it is wrong, because that is the structure on which human society is possible. If you take away the incest taboo, your society will collapse. You will not have this structure possible. The possibility of this structure is because of this. Wife taker, wife giver. So who does? So some people recoil in horror if first cousins marry, any first cousins. Whereas in other societies, right, living next to them, it is the preferred form, that a particular form of first cousin gets married to another form of first cousin. That is preferred. You get married to your uncle or niece. But how does it go? This binary is crucial. And he says, you do this, right? Oops, sorry. You do this, you identify the basic structure. Gift, for example, myths. Now look at myths. Every society builds its myths. So you have, whether in religion, whether in oral stories told by grandmothers, whether as tradition, whether as collection of experiences, whether as rituals, you have myths. So can you give me some examples of myths, say for example within India? Let me start you off by saying, say, Panchatantra. What else? Mahabharat. Anything else? What? Before that? Betal Pachisi. Vikram Betal. Singhasan Batisi, which I haven't heard of, by the way. Okay, so I'll look it up. Yeah, any of these, right? To any modern myths that you know of? Anything, right? Think of it, we'll come back to that. The point is, anything which is a myth. If Ramayana can be a myth, a lot of modern things are myths. Why is Ramayana a myth? It's a story which is told. What he's saying is, myths are basically oral traditions, stories, experiences which are put together and recounted over time. A society does this. Every society has these myths. There are a plethora of myths. You break them down into their basic structures. or what are the basic elements of a myth. Who are the main actors? What are the main actions? How is it done? And then you will find that there are a few basic types of myths globally. And all stories are built on that. So there's a thing of the child killing the father. Every culture you will end up having some form or the other, right? Of a promise that is not kept, of the sins of one generation showing themselves onto the next generation, the effects of that. For example, this whole idea, this element that myths where a natural object, whether it's fire, whether it's water, becomes an obstacle to achieving what you want to achieve. Of course, he had his own set of things. You're interested, you should go and look it up. And I can actually put up some of these sources on Moodle. But the interesting thing is, once you identify the basic structures of a myth, you can actually classify all the mythology of the world into some basic patterns. And what you find, according to Lévi-Strauss, is all the myths of the world are basically very similar in their structure. Not similar, they're exactly the same. The structure is the same. So you can take a 19th century folktale from Himachal and compare it to a 16th century folktale from Scotland, and you'll find the same structure. It works the same manner. And this idea of myth, the structural analysis of myth, is what was taken into literary criticism of the novel. That there are basically 8 plot lines. Every novel in the world base anything, there are 8 plot lines. They're just worked around in different ways. That's a structural analysis of the myth. That all myths. So once you think of this, then you look back and say, oh well, there is a lot of similarity between the Iliad and the Ramayana. But also Ramayana, the wife who's taken away across the sea. And you have to gather all these different disparate elements, right? Human, subhuman together. And it's a battle which you find impossible to win. But you do. But also Mahabharata. For example, the flood, the idea of the flood recurs in myths everywhere. The flood myth. There are certain patterns, structures to it. The role of the snake and the scorpion constantly coming in a certain manner.
Snake is always used as an evil thing.
Not necessarily. If you say that, what about Shiva? What about all the worship of the Nags? The Nag Devtas.
That poison
So-
thing is used as a...
Exactly, but even poison. So that's what I'm saying. What Lévi-Strauss is stressing is that you will not be able to understand these unless you look at them structurally. If you're going to say, oh, there's a snake story among the Aztecs, there's a snake story among the Egyptians, there's a snake story among ancient Germans, there's a snake story among the Sumerians, there's a snake story among the Chinese, there's a snake story among this and that, you won't make sense of it unless you look at it structurally. And the final thing he looked at was the gift. Now, gift is something which is common in every culture. Market society, non-market society, ancient society, modern society, big society, small society. But the gift, if you think of it, is a highly structured act. Who gives gift to whom? Who is allowed to gift? Who is not allowed to gift? is the pattern of movement of gifts. Who gives gifts to whom, how that gift goes around, the structure of gift exchange. So he picked up from another anthropologist who had actually worked on this, looking at gift exchange, to say that gift exchange is a entirely structural thing, and it is basic to every society. In fact, what Lévi-Strauss argued is that you cannot understand any society unless you understand the basic structure of gift giving within that society. Who's giving gift to whom, who's expected to give, how, when, how much, why, and how that gift circulates through various forms of exchange through society. It is central. And he says that these things, right, all these together basically create the basic structure of society. And drawing on Saussure, what he does is to say that we have to study it the way Saussure studies language, the langue, the basic structure. And you have to look for all of these kinship. You have to look at the relations between the constituent elements. Who's the wife taker? Who's the wife giver? What is the relationship? How is it built? What role does myth and gift play in kin relations? So, for example, the study of kin relations in India will have to include both the gift and the myth, particularly the gift, at least among those relations, those societies where kin relations are built on Kanya Dan. Dan being like a gift. Who gives that gift? How does the incest taboo work? So different societies which have Kanya Dan will have different incest taboos, not the same. So how does it work? That is what we need to find out. So structural anthropology, finally, as it developed, right, Lévi-Strauss being the most important person in that, structural anthropology as it developed was the study of society to identify its structures. You don't try and build a whole series of, oh, this happened and that happened, and in this society this happens, and in that society that happens. Those are for travelogues. Those are for travel writers. For social scientists, for anthropologists, sociologists, what you need to do is to identify the structures. What are those structures? What are the binaries? How are they linked to each other? How do they function? What it does is that it allows comparison. You can actually compare all societies, all human societies across the world. And as claims are made, eventually across time, once you have a structural understanding of society, you can look at the same society, you can say, okay, how did urban India function in 1910 and 2010? Which is basically allowing us to identify change. This is how the structure changed. This is how the relation between the different things changed. This is how the binary relationship changed. And finally, what they came to argue is that structures are real. Human agency is bounded by structures. What we had started with, right? That structures are primary, agency is secondary. This is a different way of saying that. That structures are real and actions are determined by them. Actions are ephemeral in a sense. What actions you take, it doesn't beyond a point matter. So in a classroom, say in 1910, if I had gone and slapped a student, or if the student had slapped me, it would be a very different thing because of the basic structure. The action is determined. What the action means, how do you understand the action, is determined by the structure. That structure has changed. So today, if I go and slap a student, or if a student slaps me, it will be seen differently from 100 years ago because those basic underlying structures have changed. Those actions become meaningful only because the structures have changed. Unless we understand the undergrid, the foundation. So for social sciences, it doesn't really matter what happens. And the extension from there was that it doesn't matter in history either, or anything, what happens. As we'll see in later classes, there were a whole range of Marxists who came up and said, well, actually, before all these guys did, Marx said that, because he said it basically matters, human actions are irrelevant beyond a point. What matters are the larger structures of society, capitalism. So if you are a capitalist, it doesn't matter whether you really love the poor or you hate the poor, you will behave in the same way. Your actions will still be the same. It doesn't matter whether you are left wing or right wing, if you are a worker, you will still be doing the same thing. So a lot of people then argued that Marx was actually can be understood as a structuralist, the original structuralist in a sense. His understanding of capitalism was actually a structuralist understanding. People said the same thing about gender, about language. A range of social sciences then opened up to an understanding where structure is real and human actions are secondary. So we don't really, once you have understood the structure, you might want to waste your time looking at individual actions, but that's not necessary. Real knowledge is this. So it's like this, that once you know the structure of a program and how program is done, that's what is important. Finally, how that app is created, whether it's got a blue background or a green background, is irrelevant. Those are ephemeral. That can keep changing. All right, so do you have questions? Or what I would suggest is that we will hold the questions back able for a whole class at the end of this, because these lead on to others. So next we will be talking about the three people that I had spoken about earlier, Ronald Barthes and Foucault, and who was the Derrida, yeah, of course. So we'll talk about that and post-structuralism. And the whole idea here, now you are saying that structures are real. Post-structuralism was an attempt to bring back the importance of human agency, that human actions also make a difference. How I behave, how you behave, what you do also makes a difference. How do you understand it within the broad framework of structuralism? So we'll do that, right? All right, thank you.